So I'm joined today by two great guests. Our featured author is Mackenzi Lee. Mackenzi holds a BA in history and an MFA in creative writing from Simmons College. She is the author of the New York Times bestselling Montague Siblings series. This series kicked off in 2017 with The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue, which was a New York Times bestseller, an ABA bestseller, has been optioned for film by Greg Berlanti for HBO, and was a 2018 Stonewall Honor Book and won the New England Book Award. Mackenzi is also the author of Bygone Badass Broads, a collection of short biographies of women in history you probably don't know about, but definitely should, based on her viral Twitter series of the same name, and The History of the World in 50 Dogs, which is the same thing, but dogs. She is currently finishing a series with Marvel detailing the origin stories of fan favorite anti-heroes from the MCU and comics verse, including Loki, Nebula, and Gamora. In 2020, Mackenzi was included in the Forbes 30 Under 30 media list. Her short fiction and nonfiction has appeared in the Boston Globe, Atlas Obscura, Teen Vogue, and Bust Magazine, among others. Mackenzi will be joined in conversation by Kay Huggins. Hi, Kay. Kay is a creative, the owner of Aphelion Editing and Consulting, and the host of the Raindrop Corner Podcast. As a longtime resident of Jacksonville, Florida, they have sought to support local artistry, foster thought-provoking content, and aid in human rights advocacy. For over a decade, their life has been dazzled with project management, technology industries, logistics, writing, and production. Through the intersectionality of Kay's craft, they aim to champion the community by providing a platform to marginalized groups. Currently, Kay is writing their debut novel and enjoying leisure moments with their wife and fur babies. So Kay, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. Thank you everybody for being present today. And Mackenzi, I'm so excited to interview you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Okay, I'm so sorry. My dad is looking for me about 10 feet away and he can't find me. So there we go. Okay, he's got it. We're good. Hello. It's so nice to talk to you.
It's nice to talk to you too. And don't feel bad. Like, this probably will be interrupted by a dog and a cat at some point in time. So I apologize to everyone.
Oh, I've got traffic going. I'm at a rest. Like, it's going to be a nightmare, but it's going to be our nightmare. And it's going to be great.
I'm excited. Let's do it. But seriously though, I'm so angry that I didn't discover your work sooner. Like, I was feeling as I read your work, whether it's Marvel or whether it was the other novels, your Montague series that you had, because LGBTQ plus historical fiction is so hard to find, or at least it was. I feel like now it's becoming...
No, it still is. In my opinion anyway, I still feel like it's non-existent. Every time I feel like there's a surplus, I work at a bookstore and then I go and like pull it off the shelves and I'm like, oh, so there's still 5 of these, which feels like a surplus after so long of nothing. But there's not enough historical fiction. We're doing great in other areas, but historical fiction is so woefully lacking.
You have to search so hard for it. Like, normally when I think historical fiction, like Sarah Waters or Melinda Lowe come to mind, because they're like the first historical fiction authors, queer authors that I personally discovered. But I did want to talk about you specifically. You are so masterful when it comes to like weaving imagery, story, and history into like a compelling but very entertaining narrative. Have you always had a pull towards history? And if so, what prompted you to channel that into your storytelling?
I have always really, really loved history. I was a historical fiction reader as a kid. I loved like any book about like a strong, plucky, sassy young woman in the 1800s who like puts on pants and joins the crew of a ship. Like, those are my favorite books as a kid. And I just had different like obsessions that all kind of tied back to history. And it never occurred to me that like, I think I like this because I like history. For a long time, it was just like, these are the things I like. Like, I had this book called Lives of Extraordinary Women that I loved, that was all it was like illustrated, and then there'd be like sort of a 2-page story about like Eleanor of Aquitaine or I was gonna say Eleanor Roosevelt, other people than just people named Eleanor. Like Murasaki Shikibu was in there, and all these women that I was super, super interested in, who all like were historical figures, but my brain didn't necessarily go like, wow, I must love history, until I was a fair amount older and I went to university and I studied history and I was going to do a PhD, and then realized that my papers all read like novels and I couldn't like write dialogue for Richard III in my academic papers. And I was like, well, that's really what I want to do. And I had a professor who kind of gently redirected me and is like, if that's the way you want to write, maybe you should try writing historical fiction. And then when I kind of got into it, I was like, oh yeah, I love this. Like I'd forgotten how to read. I'd forgotten how to read books for fun. And when I kind of went back to historical fiction, I was like, yeah, this is what I should have been doing. I just forgot it existed.
I love that. I feel like sometimes people will shy away from historical fiction because in some of like the traditional historical fiction pieces that aren't even queer based, but just general, they sometimes can feel very wordy and have so much information to where you can kind of get like distracted from the actual story. And as I was reading your work, something that really impressed me is like the flow of it. It's very engaging, and you have this really uncanny way of giving a ton of detail in just very fluid ways. So I did want to also kind of tackle a different kind of question in regards to the work that you do. You talk about a lot of serious themes, whether it's racism, mental illness, love, sexuality, gender identity, and gender expression, and also really complex familiar dynamics, which I really like. I love talking about the nuances of how families just kind of function around and with each other. As you were writing your latest novel, The Nobleman's Guide to Scandal and Shipwrecks, were there any deeper nuances to some of these themes that you wanted to touch on in this novel that maybe you hadn't been able to do before?
Okay, ask me just the question part of that one more time, because you cut out a little bit and I'm worried I missed it. Say just the question about no, it wasn't your fault at all. Something about Nobleman's Guide, right?
Yes. So I wanted to know specifically in Nobleman's Guide to Scandal and Shipwrecks, you talk about like a lot of serious issues in that story. To name a few: racism, mental illness, love, sexuality, gender identity, and family dynamics.
Okay, so, I'm with you now. Is there any I wanted to include but didn't? Are there any, because some of these themes have come up in previous novels of yours. Yes.
But I feel like here it kind of takes a little bit of a different form. So what did you want to present in this book in regards to those themes that maybe you hadn't done before?
Got it. Okay. Well, so the first book in the series, which is Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue, is very much like the sexuality and history book. The second one, which is Ladies' Guide to Petticoats and Piracy, is the feminism in history. And then the third one, which is Nobleman's Guide, is mental illness in history. But then Nobleman's Guide had the added burden of being sort of like everything also runs off the other two books into that one. So now it's not only carrying the weight of mental illness, it's also carrying all the sort of previous themes of the other books. It's also got racism and family dynamics and gender, like all of this stuff, just for virtue of being the third book in this like chaotic disaster family series. So with Nobleman's Guide, the focus for me was always on Adrian, who's the main character, and specifically about Adrian navigating his anxiety and his OCD and his depression, or kind of whatever you want to call it, as they didn't have labels for it necessarily back at that time period. But also, I think in the first two, with feminism and sexuality, when you're talking about those two things, even in a historical context, there's not really like I don't want to say there's like the end game of it is like self-acceptance, right? You can't really, not going to really treat sexuality unless you're like a creepy pray the gay away camp in Tennessee. And like I say with feminism, whereas with mental illness, Adrian's not just sort of like learning how to live with himself, live with his illness and accept it, but also like is figuring out, there's a huge bee who just flew in front of me. Everything's fine.
Good.
It's great. But Adrian's also like navigating what do I do about this? That this isn't something I can just passively live with. Like I have to work at this, and I have to figure out strategies and figure out coping mechanisms. And I know for me with my own mental illnesses I've lived with, I have moments, and I say moments, but it's really like every day where it's a struggle, and you're just like, I have to do this for the rest of my life. Like there's no way this gets better. You just get better at managing it necessarily. And so it's not like something you can hope to cure or ever really get better. You just got to deal with it. You got to figure out how to deal with it and constantly be reevaluating how to deal with it. And I wanted to portray Adrian going through that in the book, where he's not just learning to live with his mental illness, he's also learning to not even recognize it or make peace with it, but just like accept that like, this is something I got to deal with. I can't hide from it. It's not going to help me to just like pretend like it doesn't exist or not talk about it or just push it. Like it's not a healthy way to live. And so that was sort of the compounding thing for this book, because not only was it carrying the weight of thematically everything that had come before it, but also Adrian's not just learning to accept himself, he's also learning how to be better and healthier and how to do this for the rest of his life, basically.
I found that to be really important too, because something that I wanted to bring up is like, even though obviously there's still a lot of stigma around mental health nowadays, and a lot of work that we can stand to do in the modern world in terms of making it more prioritized in society. But when you go back through history, they don't have some of the tools that we have now. So getting to watch Adrian specifically have to navigate this without the ability to go see a therapist or to take medication should he choose, or other forms of meditation or yoga or things that, you know, we could easily do now, was very interesting to see. And also, you know, his siblings kind of navigating that, his mental illness as well, and kind of meeting him where he is eventually throughout the story. So I think it's a really important thing to portray, because a lot of times, at least speaking for myself and just other things I've seen expressed in mental health circles, there is this pressure to make it better or to make it go away. And a lot of times that's really not something that you can do. You have to learn how to navigate it and to also accept it, so that you aren't as self-deprecating and you're able to kind of function a little bit better with things outside of just focusing on your mental illness. With that in mind.
Oh, sorry. Can I sidebar for that really quick? I was just going to say, it's interesting you mentioned that, because there is, even as a writer who deals with that, even as someone who entered into this book very conscious of like the sort of like miracle trope or miracle cure tropes and like not going to do that. There was still a part of me when I was working on the book that was like, I don't know how to end this on a happy, and I talked to my editor about this. She was like, I don't know how to end this happily when the note is still like, I'm still just as sick as I was at the start of this book. Like it can be a little tough, and you run into that a little bit with the first one as well. But especially with the third one, because I'm trying to spoil it, but because you're so in Adrian's head and you're so right there with him and experiencing it all with him, I had to sort of break my own thought patterns about that, because I ran into that too, where I was like, how do I write a happy ending for this book where he isn't cured and magically not anxious and depressed anymore at the end? And like it's such a destructive thought pattern that we think those things are mutually exclusive. And so it just made, when you said that, I'll add that I almost fell into that trap as well, but thankfully I was very hyper aware of avoiding that.
As a writer though, it probably can become so easy to do, because I mean, your stories are interesting because like it's entertaining, it's fun, but it also has elements of really serious topics in it. But for the most part, like there's this lighthearted air to them. So I
always have to tell people, I'm like, these are the most fun books you'll ever read about racism and mental illness and childhood abuse and sexual, like they're really fun, I promise.
Can also agree with that statement. It was a really fun read, but also a very important one. I did want to ask though, how do you find that balance in your story? Like when you're talking about these serious themes, how do you pull the reader in and also express how important what you're trying to say is? Just kind of take us through your process of crafting scenes like that.
I mean, I think so much of it is just life. And that all of our lives are a balance of good and bad, and we deal with tough things with humor and with levity, and your relationship with people affects how you talk about these things. And in the first book, especially, Monty really sort of uses humor and avoidance as an unhealthy coping mechanism for not dealing with this stuff, and he gets called out on that a bunch throughout the book, and that's part of his sort of overall journey through the book, is recognizing like you can't just run from these things, you can't just hide from these things, even if you think you're bad at quote unquote bad at dealing with them. Like if you love people, you're going to take these issues on for them. And also just like recognizing them as real is really essential, and recognizing your own issues as being real is incredibly important in not self-deprecating and taking yourself seriously, and taking your own identity as seriously as you take others. And also, I think we tend to think of history as being very very different from us, which in a lot of ways it is, right? Like if we went back in time, none of us would probably recognize the world. But I think as soon as you dig a little deeper, and one of the things that I really love about history, and that for me has always made historical fiction such a fun genre for me, is that people are the same. Like, people don't really change. And as much as we wouldn't recognize the shoes they wore or the way they held their salad forks or whatever, when you get down to the core of people, they're always the same. And that's why these stories, I think, work so well. That, of course, we're talking about sexuality in the 1700s because people dealt with it. Of course, we're talking about mental illness and feminism. And I hate these ideas that we're the first generation to ever have to deal with any of those things. Just because we like have an internet and gave these things a name doesn't mean they've never existed before. So for me, a lot of it is just like taking people in history seriously as people and as individuals, and as not sort of like ignorant or simple or behind in sort of and their knowledge about themselves, but taking them seriously as people with an identity that they want to reconcile, and taking their wants and needs seriously. One of my favorite things when I was researching Gentleman's Guide was I read a journal from a guy who was on his grand tour named James Boswell. And when you read the journal, he traveled for years and years. So he wrote just like tons and tons of journals. And most of them, as I was reading them, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't relate to any of this. But he's like, I'm at the opera tonight. I'm going sword fighting, and then we're going to live in a villa in France. And I'm just like, rich people problems. And then I got to an entry of his, though, that said something it was a very short entry. And it was just like, I'm paraphrasing obviously, but it was something to the effect of like, today I felt so crummy, I couldn't get out of bed. And I feel like I totally wasted the day. And also I'm kind of a waste of space. And I was like, ding, 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 that I can relate to. Can't relate to all the opera villa stuff, but I can relate to that feeling. And for me, that moment of research was so critical to the way I approached all of the books, which is just like, yes, their world might be different, their situation might be different, but at our core, people are people. People stay the same.
They do. And I mean, I think that looking at the patterns in history and being able to apply that to your novel also humanizes the characters too, kind of endears us to them a little bit more.
Well, it just reminds us that people from the past they're different than us, but they're the same as us. And I've been reading a lot for a different project lately about women in history, and particularly about this very famous, well, I guess not famous is maybe the wrong word, but a historically important rape case from the 1600s of a painter named Artemisia Gentileschi, who, when she was a painter, she was raised by a painter. She's a painter from the Italian Baroque era, and one of the few women artists whose story has survived, or whose work has survived to our day and is actually credited to her, which is remarkable. And when she was 17, she was raped by one of her father's students, and she actually took him to trial and prosecuted him, which I told you we're not going to talk about current events, and we're not. But especially in the shadow of everything that's happened recently, it's huge. It's huge now. It's even bigger in the 1600s. And I've been reading a lot about this. I promise this is going somewhere. I've been reading a lot. I do just like to tell historical anecdotes, but I promise there's a point. But so as I've been reading about this woman, you see so they had to prosecute, in order for this trial to go through the Italian court system at the time, they had to prosecute it as a property case. So instead of, they're not suing him for rape, they're suing him for damage of property, because this has now damaged her dowry, and now she's damaged goods, quote unquote, and now won't get the dowry that she would have inherited when she got married. And that's the father was suing the student. Anyways, point is, I've gotten very frustrated reading some scholarly articles about Artemisia, because lots of scholars sort of take it as we can't see this case as a moment of feminism or girl power in the way that it's been sort of co-opted into by modern audiences, because Artemisia would have thought of herself as property, and Artemisia would have this case was tried as a property case because that's how she thought of herself, and that's how we thought of women at the time. And I'm sorry, but that's BS. There's no way that it doesn't. I don't care who you are. I don't care what world you're in. And I know, because I've grown up in I grew up in a fairly conservative situation where I wasn't always aware of the words for sexuality and gender identity and things like that. But I still figured myself out, and I still knew myself. And it becomes sort of just pedantic BS to say just because she's a woman in the 1600s, she too would think of her only value as a human being as a piece of property for a man to wed, and therefore she wouldn't have any sense of self-value outside of her. I don't know. It was just it's been endlessly frustrating to me as I've been reading, and has been such a good reminder to me that these stories are so important, that because we have to treat people like people. And in the past, we have to treat people like they have a sense of autonomy and worth, and they know their value, and they know themselves, and they find ways. I mean, we kind of hide, I'm sorry, I'm just soapboxing now. We kind of hide it.
You're not.
It's starting to come to light, which is that too, when you look at queer people in history, we say like, oh, there were no queer people, or ideas about queerness and sexuality and gender identity are all 21st century. They're all modern. None of them existed in the past. And it's like, well, not really. Like, if you look for these stories, they're there. They're often hidden for a reason, which is that's how these people had to survive. I'm sorry, ask a question. I'm just going.
No, everything you're saying is valid, because I find it so dismissive when people, and it's normally, just being honest, a cis white male who does it, tends to kind of steamroll over people who don't fit into a specific box. Whether it's, whether or not you're a feminist, or the presence of queer people back in like 16, 17, 1800s or beyond that. And I mean, I remember the first lesbian or LGBTQ plus book that I read was a very sad book by the name of The Well of Loneliness. And this is going to sound like a tangent.
A devastating title.
Yeah, I think it is the first piece of lesbian literature to ever be like published, if I'm not mistaken, if I have the history of that correct. And in the book, I think it's written by Radcliffe Hall is her name. And in the book, she extensively talks about a character that I think possibly might be loosely based off of herself, who is a lesbian. And I believe it takes place, I'm so sorry if I'm wrong, everyone. I think it takes place in like the 1600s or something like that. And it's about her coming out and learning that, she doesn't fall into what society would consider the traditional woman. And as she gets older, she starts to kind of engross herself in these various communities of queer people that are kind of hiding. They're under the guise that, they are heterosexual and they have relationships with mates of the opposite sex, but they're either hiding or they do have partners of the same sex, and they're in the artist community. And it's kind of a place that reminds me of like Allen Ginsberg times in New York, and just like that atmosphere. But a lot of people don't know. Sorry, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, queer history is so fun to study, because it's fun because you have to kind of seek out the stories, and that actually doesn't make it fun. That makes it terribly sad that we're not telling these stories as they are. But still, it can be, for me, it can be very exciting to find these stories. I think that's more what it is, more than fun. It's exciting and it's validating. And I get a tiny bit squicky sometimes that some people, usually on Twitter, get very excited about grandly proclaiming that such and such historical figure was definitely transgender, and there's no argument against it, and there's no real proof, but I'm just sure. And I don't care for that, because I don't like it when we do that to people in modern day, and I don't think we should do it to historical figures, because I think it's really important to take people where they are and take what people tell us. And this idea that like people in the past couldn't express themselves or couldn't have relationships, and I'm sure there were closeted people, of course there were people who suppressed their sexuality, but then you have people like Anne Lister, who was this, if you guys don't know who Anne Lister is, like, please, everybody go read everything about this woman. She's incredible. And there's a great TV show about her right now called Gentleman Jack. But Anne Lister was a woman in the 1800s in England who was writing in journals, "I love only the fairer sex and desired no affection but theirs." And it's like, okay, so she knew, like, she gets it. She wasn't like closeted or lying to herself. She knew who she was. And I think it's interesting too, that when we talk about LGBTQ experiences in the modern day, we understand, yes, I love Anne Lister. We understand that there is so much variable, there are so many variables that affect your experience as a queer person, whether it depends on your race and your religion and your gender identity and your socioeconomic station. Like, all of those things are going to affect how you as a queer person experience the world. And we don't tend to grant that individuality to people in the past. And we say, okay, well, that means that we're all different. We all experience things differently. But in the past, clearly everybody before Rent came out was sad and oppressed and couldn't be with the people they love. When really, like, people in the past had just as variable of experience as we did. And one of the things I love about Anne Lister too is that she was in a community in Northern England where she lived openly with her wife and lived and like got married, and had many girlfriends publicly, but also then eventually got married and had a wife and lived with her wife. And the community was way more upset that she was a business owner than that she was a lesbian. And I love that. And I love these examples of like your community matters and the people around you matter. And you mentioned that the character in the book you read finds like a queer community, and there's history is littered with examples of that. In one of my favorite statistics is that in the UK in the 1750s, there were more gay bars in London than there were in the 1950s. And there was a scene in an early draft of a Gentleman's Guide where Monty and Percy actually went to one of these like gay clubs. And then I tried to repurpose it because it was a setting I wanted to get in so bad and acknowledge like this was a real thing. But and so I tried to repurpose it into Nobleman's Guide. It didn't end up in there, but there are some sort of like oblique references when Monty is talking to Adrian in book 3, where he sort of references these places where he and Percy can be themselves and can be out and can be open. And even I really wanted to make sure that in Adrian and Felicity, who are Monty's siblings, you have sort of 2 different reactions to his relationship with Percy, whereas Felicity, it takes a little bit for her to come around. And I don't read reviews. I don't really engage with critique, but the critique that makes me craziest about the books is that Felicity is homophobic, which makes me crazy because she's not. She's someone who's been raised in a certain community with a certain mindset. And so when her brother comes to her and says like, I am in love with my best friend, who's also a guy, she doesn't come around to it right away. And that's fine. And that's normal. And I hate this idea that if people don't react perfectly right away, they're a lost cause. And so Felicity, it takes a little bit longer for her to come around, not because she's a prejudiced character, but just because of this is how she's been raised. This is sort of the upbringing this is the thing she's been told her whole life and never thought to question it. Now suddenly Monty's relationship with Percy throws it into question, and for the better. Like she interrogates her past beliefs for the better and reevaluates. Whereas Adrian is a character who has had he's had a childhood of neglect in a lot of ways. And as a result has fallen in with really, really liberal people in sort of the far left of English politics at the time. And he's very close with his fiance's brother, who's a radical leader in the House of Parliament. And it's not in I don't think it ended up in the final draft, everyone, like, because there was a thing about me. Anyways, point is, like, for me, Adrian at the time, like Adrian has a much more sort of like right away reaction to Monty being like, okay, like that's fine. There's still things about queer culture that Monty teaches him and shows him and that he learns. I don't remember where I was going with this. I just started talking about.
Okay, I get where you're going with it though. At least
yeah, I think you do too. The real point of it is that there is such a variety of experience, and there's such a variable experience, both for people in history and for the reactions they got to that, and for the way their community responded to that. And I wish we saw more of that portrayed rather than this like blanket, we have to hide, we have to keep it secret. One of us will be murdered and the other will be married off to a dude. Like, I wish we had more room for that variable experience, and especially because we love found families and found queer communities in sort of our modern day stories. I wish we would also recognize that that's been a reality for forever. And I want to see those, like, I don't know, Victorian lesbian found families. Somebody write that. It's almost as if Sarah Waters has it 85 times, and I'm not mad about it.
But no, I did it with Felicity's reaction. I felt that that's what you were going for, and I loved it. Because, you know, even in modern times, if you're not used to queer relationships or any type of relationship on the LGBTQIA plus spectrum, it might take some getting used to, and you're not necessarily being hateful as you just don't fully understand. And sometimes that takes time. And I like the way you represent characters. You mentioned Vice and Verse You a little bit ago, and something that I really enjoy, like you see the character Monty begin to embrace people as they are, as opposed to like trying to fix or refine them. And then you even see Percy's character, who is his love interest, grow more independent and confident in his own voice. So when you're writing your novels, what kind of characters do you want to present to people, and what have you learned from your characters?
I mean, the characters I want to present are deeply flawed characters, and people who don't have a perfect understanding of the world around them, because I think none of us do, and people who are constantly learning and reevaluating where they are, and who can maybe be products of their upbringing or products of where they come from, but not victims of it, and are not interrogating their own origin stories and their own sort of destructive thought patterns they've fallen into. So yeah, my thing is always, I want to write people who have real issues. I grow tired of, especially women, but characters of any sort, the sort of lead character where like their main flaw is they're too clumsy. I'm like, that's not really, or people who are like, I want an unlikable female character. And then you're like, okay, so here's one, and she's kind of mean and jealous, and she doesn't do the right thing. And she doesn't immediately accept her brother when he comes out to her, and people are like, no, that's too unlikable. It's like, well, I always steer towards unlikable characters. I love kind of like the archetype of like a scoundrel with a heart of gold. That's always my favorite, which I think Monty kind of falls into. And then, sorry, what was the second part of your question?
The second part was, what have you personally learned from the characters that you've created?
I think just sort of, I mean, I've all the Montagues represent some different piece of me. Not something I kind of did intentionally. It's just, I think all authors are kind of working through their own trauma through their characters and through their books, whether they know it or not. And so for me, all three of them sort of represent different things about myself, or share things with me that I feel like I've been working my whole life to try and I'm still working at trying to make peace with, or trying to be more, like you talked about Monty learning to take people as they are and being more accepting. I mean, the biggest thing in the book though is he has to do that to himself, and he has to take himself where he is and not expect himself to be a different person before he can start practicing self-love. And that's been sort of the main message for me from my characters. And the thing I was going to say, I've learned it, but I haven't learned it so much as like I'm still trying to learn it. I keep writing these books because I still haven't learned it and have to keep working on it.
Well, I feel like that's one of those things that you have to put into daily practice. And like, as you probably already know, being human you're a constant student trying to grow and refine and become better. And I'm curious too, like we've talked a lot about different stories and themes and like what drew you to history and some of the things that you want to highlight, not only about communities of women, but also the LGBTQIA plus community and, our place in that community and what it's looked like over time. Tell me a little bit about your writing journey. Have you always enjoyed telling stories, or was it more of something that developed over time?
Both. When I look back sort of at what felt like I remember at the time, like when I decided I wasn't going to do a PhD, I was going to do an MFA. I remember feeling sort of like, wow, I wasted so much time. Or there's been a lot of moments in my life where even like when I started working as a bookseller, it's sort of like, okay, so this is what I'm going to do temporarily until I get the thing I really want. And now I look back on it, I'm like, of course, like everything fed into each other so naturally, even if at the time it didn't feel like it did. Because everything teaches you things about yourself. And for me, the big sort of connecting thread for everything in my life has always been storytelling. I love telling stories, whether it's, I would write little stories when I was a kid, like a lot of people do. I was the kid who like wrote plays and then forced my neighbors to put them on. I am all of the Montagues, but I'm very Felicity in terms of like my level of bossiness and just like desperation to be in charge of everyone. Like if you're not taking it as seriously as I am, you're not taking it seriously, and I'm taking it very seriously. So I did that when I was a kid. When I was in high school, I kind of stopped reading. I look back now and I think I was probably I was an enthusiastic reader as a kid. I was not a very good reader. I really loved like reading the Star Wars novelizations from the time. And I loved reading books that were easy. And then as soon as you gave me something that kind of challenged me a little bit, I just gave up on it. And so when I got to high school and even middle school and started getting assigned all of these books, I was like, well, don't like these, not going to read them. Also, I hate books. And it wasn't until I kind of, I traveled abroad when I was in college, and when I was spending all this time in like train stations and bus stations and airports, it's like, what do people do with their time when they're traveling? These weird bookstores seem to be at every at every place. Maybe I should check this out. And I kind of remembered like, oh yeah, I really like reading. This was fun one time. And when you can self-select, it's more fun. But even when I look back on, and I mentioned this a little earlier, when I look back at my sort of ill-fated history degree, the thing I've always loved about history is I love the stories. I love telling stories. I love telling the stories. And that's why I periodically interrupt conversations. I'm like, here, I should tell you about this woman from the 1600s. I only can remember like half the details, but it's great. And that's always been my preferred method of studying history. So yeah, it's always been storytelling. That's always been the thing for me. I didn't really start taking creative writing seriously until I sort of later in college and then into my MFA. I sort of went into my MFA without really, I mean, I knew I liked writing, but I look back now and I'm kind of horrified at how ill prepared, like I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. And like, thank goodness this worked out, because otherwise I was like, ugh, you almost thoughtlessly sunk a lot of money into that. It worked out, so it's fine. But yeah, I'm a storyteller. That's always the person I've been. And I started taking creative writing more seriously when I was in my early 20s. And I don't know that there's really a journey from, like, that's kind of the journey. Is I read a lot of things. I wrote a lot of things without ever thinking of writing as something that can seriously be a career. And then eventually I circled around and was like, you know what, the one thing all these things have in common is writing stories. Maybe I should try that.
And it worked out for you too.
It did. It's been going okay.
I love that. And I love also, and you brought it up earlier, I love how you honor strong women and girls in your work, and specifically that you illuminate that innate quality that women are powerful, even in moments where they feel like they don't have power. And I want to ask you, and this might be hard to quantify, but who are some of the most influential women in your life?
Quantify. So one of the first ones that comes to mind is actually the woman who Ladies Guide to Petticoats and Piracy is dedicated to, which is my childhood librarian. Her name is Janelle. And my mother and my sister and I used to go to the library every single week. My sister and I would always go back straight to the kids' desk, and Janelle would always be there. And she was just, I remember as a kid, she was like the first person that took me seriously. It felt like as an adult, that when I would talk to her about books, whether I was telling her about what I was reading or asking her for recommendations, I just remember being so struck by the way she listened to me. And it just felt like I was like, this person is not listening to me like adults listen to kids. Like, she is listening to me human to human. And I remember showing her some of the like stories I wrote when I was 7 or 8 in my little purple sparkly notebook. And she like wrote me these lovely letters with these like, this like feedback. And I mean, they're the writing of a 7-year-old. It's not quality. And she took it so seriously. I have this very strong memory of my sister, who was like 4 years old at the time, very intently explaining to Janelle, like, she goes, I need the pink kitty book. And Janelle was just like, leaning and listening to her and just going down the list and being like, is it this book? And Molly goes, no, it's the pink kitty book. And she goes, is it this? Let me ask you a few more. And and sat there for like an hour with her and finally found the quote unquote pink kitty book my sister had invented in her brain. And she was wonderful that way. And she was so, like, every time I'd go back and visit her, I stopped going to the library because I began hated books for a while. But like as an adult, I remember going back and visiting her, and she was always the same way. And I went and saw her the day my first book was up for pre-order for the first time. And I was so excited. And I told her, and she immediately pulled out her phone or on the computer or something. She was like, I'm going to pre-order it right now. And I watched her pre-order it, and she was just always she took me so seriously, and she took my work so seriously, and just like treated me like a person, which is a great gift when you're a child. And so she's one of the first people that always comes to mind. I also think of a woman I worked for, this woman named Jan Pinborough, who is the managing editor at a magazine that I worked for. So she oversaw this whole kids magazine. And I was so struck by her. I was probably 20 or 21 when I worked for her. And I was so struck by her because at the time I was so into these like barn burning women who were shouting and screaming and writing manifestos. And even in history, I felt like I and this ended up in Ladies Guide a little bit, that I got very hung up on, like, there is one way to be a strong woman, and it is to do things that it is to embody traditionally masculine traits. Obviously traits don't have a gender, but like this idea of like, in order for it to be taken seriously as a woman, you have to act like a man. And that's sort of the feminism I had subscribed to for a long time. And Jan was one of the first people I met who was I was just so conscious of, I was like, you are so soft spoken. You are so gentle. You are so kind. All of these things that I thought of as being sort of weak feminine traits. And then I met Jan, who ran this department, who ran it so well and so smoothly. And I watched her at meeting after meeting, just like put men in their place by sort of weaponizing this gentleness and this soft spokenness. And I was always so struck by that. And she was very formative to me, because I do think she kind of came into my life in a moment when I had a very specific idea about what feminism was, and she sort of, or what even being a strong woman or the quote unquote right kind of woman was, and she sort of turned all that on its head for me.
I love that. As a child, it's very often you get treated like, you're being ridiculous sometimes, or you're kind of dismissed. And it's nice that you had someone there to kind of acknowledge things that were important to you. And then with Jan, you had the ability to learn that there are different types of ways to be a feminist, and to kind of
ways to be strong.
Yeah, to be strong, to navigate through life. And I do want to turn it over to Rebecca, because we're actually coming up on our Q&A. So Rebecca,
Yes.
I will let you interject
Can
here.
you even believe it? Yes. So thank you
Now
guys.
that I've
so
rambled
much.
for forever.
It was awesome. So I thank you so much for the conversation thus far. We will open it up to our audience Q&As. So if you guys have any questions you'd like to ask Mackenzi, go ahead and type it in the chat. Kay will ask her any questions you have.
And we actually have one already, so I will go ahead and read this one off to you, Mackenzi. So yes. Yasmin says, I'm a huge fan of your Montague Siblings book series, especially Felicity's book. Can you talk a little bit about what it meant to you to write an Arrow/Ace character? Love you.
Yeah. So in the first book, so you have to bear in mind too, when I wrote the first book in that series, which is Gentleman's Guide, I didn't think it would, and I know a lot of authors say this, sort of like, I just wrote this silly, weird story for me. I never thought it would be published. I legitimately was like in a funk. My first book had just come out. I was super depressed and I couldn't figure out how to like commodify art. And I was going through the like weird mental gymnastics of being like, here's this thing I've always done because I loved it. And now somebody's like put a price tag on it and I'm trying to figure out my own value based on how many people are buying it just like messed with me, and I couldn't write anything. And I had a second book I had to write for Harper. My also, bless his heart, I love it so much. My first book just like failed spectacularly, and Harper would not have published another book from me if they didn't have to, but they had me for a 2-book deal. And so I had to write another one for him. And I proposed this like sad book about Chicago steel mills in the 1890s, where everybody was like sad and losing limbs and had cholera, and it was terrible. And I was sad and didn't have cholera, but I felt like I had emotional cholera. And I was just like sad and couldn't work on anything. And so I decided, I was like, I'm going to write just something for me. Nobody's ever going to read it. So it can be as silly and weird and goofy and inappropriate as I want it to be, which is why the streaking in Versailles scene exists. And I still don't know how that ever made it to the final draft, but I was like, I'm just gonna write this weird, silly kind of adventure novel that I really love. And so I really, truly wrote the first book as just something that was gonna be for me. And then eventually it hit a point where Harper was like, okay, so we actually need a book from you, your contract's gonna expire. And I was like, oh, didn't write this odd Chicago steel mill book. Instead, the only thing I've written is this weird historical romp. Do you want this? And was shocked that they did, and that they didn't make me cut the Versailles scene. But so I only thought it was gonna be one book. And then and I had put these sort of like in my head, Felicity was an Arrow Ace character. And that was just like my headcanon about the book. And then I had put in little sort of like Easter eggs. I felt like it was like, if you're reading between the lines, if you're looking for it, you'll get it. And I know that's always like, it's super frustrating. And that's how queer rep has been for so long, is like, oh, if you read between the lines of these good friends, like, or you can sort of read it as queer if you want to. And I did that only because I was like, it's not her narrative. It's not something that really like fits into the story, but I want people to know it's here. And then when my editor approached me about writing a second book, one of the things I was most excited about with book 2, Felicity, was getting to explore that and getting to give that piece of her identity its due, and making that a real piece of her character. And then even more than that, getting to do the third one then, which was also a surprise, getting to do the third one and see her like 20 years down the road. And she's not married. She's not heartbroken. She's a totally self-sufficient Arrow Ace woman I guess she's in her late 30s at that point, who's just like doing fine. So it was great to sort of get to portray her at every stage of her life and never sort of take back that piece of her character or do anything, because this is, again, when you sort of like read the queer rep into it and you're reading between the lines, it's like, oh, it's fun until somebody gets married. And then you're like, well, and so with Felicity, it was nice to make that sort of an established piece of her character, an established canon for every stage of her life.
I really like that. You could definitely see the consistency there. And I think it added so many more layers to her character. So Rebecca has a question, and she asks, Mackenzi, what is your next project? When is your next book coming out?
I can actually talk about this. I haven't been able to talk about this in so long. And I've been doing all these interviews where I'm like on pins and needles the whole time, because one time I did an interview with someone for Marvel and my publicist was on the phone, like on mute the whole time. And somebody asked about the next book. And I was like, thought I was so smart. And I was like, I can't tell you anything about it, except I can tell you. And then I said something that I thought was super vague that nobody would ever get. I was like, it's about chess. And immediately my publicist took herself off mute and was like, you can't say that. You can't spread that. And I was like, oh no. So I got very nervous, and every interview. And it's hard when you're like, I was promoting Nobleman's Guide while writing this book. And so I was like deeply immersed in like the Cold War and World War II, and trying not to like accidentally say something about that or just like make a flippant reference to Bucky Barnes while I was talking about the Montagues. But I can actually talk about it now because it's released. The news went out on Monday. This is a Jacksonville Library Teen Lit Chat exclusive. So I've been doing a 3-book series for Marvel about anti-heroes in the Marvel universe. As teenagers, we get to see them sort of earlier in their lives than we do in the comics or in the films. So the first one is about Loki. The second one is about Gamora and Nebula. And the third one is going to be about Bucky Barnes / the Winter Soldier. And so that's what I've been working on. And that's the next thing I have coming out. And I'm so excited about it. It's been such a great project to work on. I'm a big Marvel fan, but in particular, Bucky Barnes and the Winter Soldier and that sort of dynamic Bucky's my favorite character in Marvel. He's been my favorite character for forever. I love, if you haven't read the Ed Brubaker comics about Bucky, like please go do that. And I was so excited to get to do this project, and it's just been like, they all felt like paid fan fiction, but this one really felt like paid fan fiction. So yeah, it's a book about Bucky Barnes. It's about teenage Bucky in World War II, solving a mystery with a British chess champion, and then also the Winter Soldier in the 1960s, having sort of a Cold War spy, John le Carré kind of story, solving the same mystery. Yeah, I'm super excited about it.
I love it. I cannot wait. I loved the Gamora and Nebula story and the Loki story.
Thank you. Gamora and I love Gamora and Nebula. That one doesn't get enough love because I think they get overshadowed by the fan favorite. Sorry, the fan favorite feels like an understatement. But the force of nature that is Loki and his love. So I'm always happy that Gamora and Nebula get shout outs. I love that book.
No, it was such a great piece. And I love Bucky Barnes so much. I feel like he's very underrated.
Wildly. Yes, that the whole this will be a different chat, but the whole like the Winter Soldier, Bucky Barnes, the brain, like all of it is just so, it's so angsty and it's so just like inherently emotionally rich that I don't understand why more people don't just latch onto it in Marvel, because it's so fascinating. It's such an interesting dynamic. Anyways, next.
Also, I'm going to go straight through these questions after you answer, just so we can fit them all in before the end. So the next question is
Don't let me talk.
No, you're okay. The next question is from Haley. Haley says, I'm an aspiring author, and I was wondering how you went about getting published and what was that like?
I went about getting published the very traditional route, which is I wrote a book and I sent it to agents and nobody wanted it. And so I wrote another book and I sent it to agents and nobody wanted it. So I wrote another book and I sent it to agents and 1 out of like 100 wanted it. And then no publishers wanted that. And so then I wrote another book and 1 publisher wanted that, which became This Monstrous Thing, which is my first book. So I have done it all, the very sort of, I'm a queer, I'm a slush pile kid. Like it's all been very straightforward in terms of like the most straightforward it can be. And it can work. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of letters. Or I guess emails, since it's not like 1800s.
That's a good message though, because I edit outside of here. And one of the biggest like frustrations that I see from clients is, why do people keep denying me? And like, no one's ever going to publish me because I've gotten like 20 rejection letters. So it just goes to show you that you're going to get rejection letters, but somebody out there is going to care about what you have to say. All right. And the next question is from, and I just want to make sure I'm not mispronouncing this. I believe it's from Mayra. And Mayra says or I believe actually this is from Bella. So Bella says, dealing with a character from Loki, where the mischief lies, where is Theo now?
Everyone wants to know about Theo. Books belong, after I release it, I'm very a subscriber to the author is dead and books belong to the readers, and I don't have answers for where Theo is, because that belongs to you. The book ends, my involvement with the story and the characters end where the book ends. So you'll find no answers from me, Bella. Good try.
And next up is Zariah. And Zariah asks, how many books do you plan on writing?
I have no idea until I run out of ideas or I die, whichever comes first. And I have a feeling it'll be the latter.
All right. And next up is Mayra. Mayra says, huge fan. Historical fiction has never been my genre because I always get sad vibes from it. Valid. However, the Montague series is one of my favorite series ever because it's so fun and really the only historical fiction I've read because of that. Do you have any fun historical reads similar to your own to recommend?
Yes. Okay. So I've worked as a bookseller in independent bookstores for the last 10 years. And once you ask me for book recommendations, you can't stop me. I love, especially like fun historical fiction is my favorite thing in the world. So yes, please, let's talk about this really quickly. My number one go-to all-time favorite historical adventure series, which shares a lot of DNA with Montague's in terms of just like high seas sailing adventure, is the Jackie Faber series by L.A. Meyer. The first one's called Bloody Jack. They are about a girl in the 1800s who's a street urchin kind of in London, and after witnessing a murder, she has to go on the run. So she dresses up as a boy and disguises herself and becomes a midshipman on a English Navy ship that hunts pirates, and then gets discovered pretty quickly. And so over the course of 12 books, then goes on to have all sorts of historical zany adventures that include like fighting with Napoleon and fighting along Napoleon's side, not with Napoleon personally, fighting at Waterloo. Let's go with that. And being painted by Goya and like navigating the Mississippi River. And they're so fun. Jackie is the greatest character. She's funny and she's smart and she's sassy and she's hard edged, but she also has this like real vulnerability and real unlikability to her in the way we were talking about. Like Felicity shares a lot of DNA with her just in terms of kind of being an acquired taste. And I love Jackie. And she was also a character that for me was so essential in terms of like a woman who is not always, in spite of like, she's a woman who's not always taking on men's traits in order to be a strong woman. And she likes dresses and she likes girly things and she likes to sort of be flirtatious and silly. And I just love those books. There's 12 of them. And I am not a series reader. I tend to read the first book in every series and then be like, great, loved it. Never want to read about that again. And I read every single one of those 12 Jackie Faber books and I would keep reading them forever. They are my most favorite series of all time. I would literally be here for the next hour if I was recommending things. So if any of you are interested in some fun historical Montague-esque historical fiction, you can find me on Instagram and just like DM me and say we were here in the Teen Lit chat, because I would love to send you my list because I have so many.
Awesome. That sounds really good. What's the name of the series one more time?
Jackie Faber. And the first book is called Bloody Jack and the author is L.A. Meyer.
Okay. Oh my gosh.
All right, guys. I'm so sorry, but we have run out of time. So I want to thank you all for coming to our Lit Chat today, and thanks especially to Mackenzi and Kay. I hope you all had a great time. I certainly did.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for having me. And Kay, thank you. You were so fun to talk to.
You're very welcome. This was so much fun. I mean, I knew it was going to be a fun conversation. I always enjoy the Lit Chats, but this was awesome. Thank you everyone for having me. Mackenzi, it was lovely speaking with you.
Thank you. Thank you for having, and thank you Jacksonville for having me.